Hello and welcome to Under the Mountain with Matt Godfrey. My name is Anthony Ino, and I lead Under the Mountain here at the O'Neill Library. Before we get started with this conversation, I just wanted to do a brief introduction of our guest. Matt Godfrey is an Alabama native, and his family spent years in Los Angeles as he pursued a career as an actor. When he returned to his home state, he did so as a professional audiobook reader. He's the winner of the Audiophile Earphones Award and multiple-time nominees for the Society of Voice Arts and Sciences Awards and the Independent Audiobook Awards. Godfrey is a lover of the strange and the uncanny. He has performed audio recordings for works by the likes of Michael McDowell, Poppy Z. Bright, Jonathan Jans, and Joe Lansdale. If anyone, I think, understands the power of storytelling to take you anywhere in the world, traversing even life and death, I think it's Matt Godfrey. So, Matt, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
So the first thing I would want to ask you about is to do what you do implicitly makes you a reader. And I know that comes from a place of love from having talked to you,
Yeah.
A love of reading. So as much as you read every day, what is it that draws you to the act of reading?
Well, I've always been a big reader, even as a kid. In fact, some of the stuff that I vividly remember reading first were the Goosebumps books. I think I'm also an introvert by nature, so I like to be by myself, and reading gives me such a good chance to immerse myself in a story, which I love. I mean, I've tried to structure my entire life around stories. So I love just sort of letting that wash over me. I just like stories. It lets me be by myself and kind of recharge for a little bit, which is nice. And also, I just think writers are some of the people I respect most. And I'm just like constantly in awe of really good writers. So I think that filling myself with art that I respect and think is good is very inspiring. So it kind of gives me a creative, like pulse or something. Mm-hmm. I just love it. I don't know. It's fun.
So being that acting is sort of an extroverted act, I guess this kind of makes doing what you do sort of a controlled act of being extroverted. It's on your terms and not necessarily on the spot performative that requires you to
true.
being in front of the people to do it.
I do like performing. And I guess that does seem extroverted, but I think I don't know. When I switched from doing sort of typical what you think of when you think of like an actor, like film and TV and commercial stuff, to doing audiobooks, it felt much more natural. The extroverted part of traditional acting, I think, is maybe mostly the auditioning and like networking process. Once you're on set, everybody kind of leaves you alone to like do your thing. Whereas when you're auditioning, you really have to be like on, and you have to like look like you know what you're doing, and there's a lot of pressure, and you don't get very many parts, and all that was really hard. Once I was actually on set, it felt a little easier. But when I sort of fell into audiobooks and I could read and spend a lot of time getting to know the characters that I was going to play, and I was by myself, and I do audition for some books, but it's much less than like, nobody ever just gave me a role in a movie or something. I was never at a level like that. But I don't always have to audition for books. Some people just send them to me, and that feels nice. Even auditioning for books, I'm by myself, so I can do it as many times as I want. I can prepare it as long as I want. If something isn't feeling right, schedules are generally flexible, and I can record it and trash it and do it again if I want. it just felt like it fit my personality better. But I do like performing. I do like
Yeah.
it's gratifying if somebody likes what you're doing, and I'm sure that's rooted in some sort of deep insecurity that I don't fully understand. But yeah,
Well, what is the creative life without insecurity?
yeah, exactly.
As a reader, how does the act of reading aloud differ, say, from reading quietly, I guess is how you would call it?
Yeah. Well, it's a lot slower. I move through a book a lot slower than if I'm just reading it for pleasure. When I'm just reading a book for pleasure, which has changed a lot now because now I have a hard time reading a book without like thinking of how I would do it, if I were cast in it. But typically I think when I'm reading for pleasure, all the voices sound the same to me. Like, I mean, an author will write characters differently. I don't mean it's monotone, but I don't have any sort of like, sort of like audible picture in my head of how somebody sounds. Whereas if I'm reading it out loud, I try to differentiate the characters and make them all specific. And that's a very different like part of my brain or something. It's like, it's more akin, I think, to being a director of a movie than an actor in a movie, because you're kind of, as a narrator, it's almost like you're pointing the camera at different aspects of the story and telling the audience what to look for or what to look at or what to pay attention to, as opposed to just being an actor. You're more of a storyteller in a grander sense. So when I read aloud, it's just a different part of my brain. I think I'm just thinking more of how can I make this the clearest? What's something that they might really need to pick up on this scene that I might need to emphasize, or if there's like a red herring or something that I need to maybe underplay so I don't bring too much attention to. It's it's just a different. I think I'm picturing an audience when I read out loud. As for pleasure, I obviously don't do that because the audience is me. So it's just a different experience.
When figuring out how you approach a character, do you find yourself drawing at all upon your acting experience? As far as like trying to get into the head of the character, understand why they behave in a certain way, or is...
I mean, yes, certainly. But it's a little different in that, like if I was playing a character in a movie, I'm obviously just doing that one character. So I could really spend a lot of time just with my scenes, figuring out, whatever motivations and things that actors talk about. Whereas in a book, since you're doing everybody, and also just practically speaking, the way that most audiobook narrators' schedules work, it just isn't possible to spend that much time on, so many characters in a book, or even just the main characters in a book. So a lot of that happens. So I read the book first, which is a question a lot of people ask. Do you read it first? And yes, you have to be able to tell a story. You have to know the story. And then I think, especially if the writing is good and specific, once you get to the end of the book, since you have so many, like with a novel, you have so much insight into what a character is thinking. Whereas in a film script, I'm adding that stuff in, you know what I mean? But I've got narration written in a novel that might be inside the character's head, so I have a lot more information just given to me. And I think by the end of the book, you just know the characters. So a lot of it is just absorbing what you've read and understanding the author's voice and understanding who the people are, which happens kind of like metaphysically or something. Like there might not be a ton of specific on what a character is thinking in that moment, but you just kind of know intuitively as a reader, and then it just kind of comes out naturally.
Well, I guess that goes back to that Hemingway adage of the iceberg, where you only see so much of the top of the iceberg when there's so much underneath.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, regardless of someone's feelings about Hemingway, that was immeasurably influential on this writing still today of how we approach storytelling. And the idea is a good storyteller trusts the reader to infer certain aspects about people because it's human nature. It's something that we understand.
We get it, yeah.
One thing I was curious about, since we'll have plenty of time to talk about horror in a second, is
with doing audio reading, have you found yourself drawn to other genres or even types of reading, say like nonfiction, more so than you once thought you would, or more than you once thought you had interest in?
Yeah, I don't really read nonfiction for pleasure. It just has never. I just really like a story. A lot of nonfiction has a story, but you know what I mean. I mean,
sure.
I just like novels, But as I've gotten cast in more nonfiction and I'm forced to read it, I find there's some of it that I really enjoy. Political nonfiction I really like. I've somehow gotten quite a few climate change books. I did one called Losing Earth a couple of years ago, and it led to a few other ones. And I find that I really am drawn to that. I really enjoy it. I did one called Pandemic Inc. about our response to our initial response to COVID and how bad it was. And that sort of stuff really fascinates me. It's not something I would probably ever just pick up and read, but I found that I really enjoy it when I'm working on it.
How do you approach tone with something like nonfiction? Whereas,
yeah, it depends. It depends on how it's written. So specifically for Pandemic Inc., it was a book written by a ProPublica reporter, and it had like a really clear voice. It was not neutral at all. It was like sarcastic, and it poked fun at certain things. It was just a very clear voice. So that was easy to do because I felt like I agreed with the author a lot, which doesn't always happen. I felt like he and I shared a really similar view of things. And so it was easy for me to kind of speak naturally like I would about a topic that I was interested in. I did another nonfiction book that I really liked by Barry Lopez, who's a naturalist writer, called Of Wolves and Men. And that was much more scientific and straightforward. And he does have kind of like a caring tone in his writing, but it still is much more neutral and kind of like, I'm going to present these facts to you. That makes it sound dry and dull. It isn't. But that was one where I just had to trust that his writing was really, really good, and I didn't need to add anything or do anything special. Like, you can kind of just, as long as you understand it, read it clearly, and like, his writing does the work for me. So I guess I would say for nonfiction, and I mean, this is true of fiction too, it really depends on the style of the writing.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, when it comes to any kind of storytelling, because like you said, nonfiction is a form of storytelling. The writing really, I think, is at the end of the day the most important thing, which is, as much as I love the horror genre, that is, with any genre, there's plenty that the writing is not always the highest caliber, not to name any names or anything like that, but I just feel like that
an integral component to storytelling that I'm sure someone who appreciates that has a big play on how well you're able to engage with an audiobook. Do you find yourself at all really just having to go through the motions still, or can you do you have like
You mean like if a book is not that good?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I have been, in general, really lucky that I have not done just that many books that are bad. I've definitely done some books that are bad. By and large, I've enjoyed most of them. But when the writing is bad, it is significantly harder. Like, my job doesn't feel like a job every day. It feels like I'm like waiting for somebody to come in and tell me that this is not really real. Like,
Yeah.
I'm so lucky to get to do what I do. When the writing is bad, there's just so much more effort involved. It's like you can just feel that like something is not clicking right, and you're maybe trying to force things. Or one of the worst things is when maybe the writing is not just like horrible, like you can't point to something like this is bad, but when all the characters on the page are exactly the same, like everybody speaks the same, there's nothing that differentiates anyone. That's hard, because then it's kind of like they say, like, I'm not going to remember the exact right thing, but in like improv, it would be much harder to do a scene on a completely blank stage than it would be to do a scene on a stage with a chair. The chair like gives you so much to do. It could become many things. You could sit on it, you could stand on it. It's just something, to anchor you. And sometimes if the writing is not good, it feels like being on a stage with nothing. You're just like, wow, what am I going to do? I could do I've got to do something to make these people different. And it all feels arbitrary. You're like, I'm going to give this guy an accent, I guess, because I don't know. This guy is going to sound, I don't know. He's,
Well, there's no texture there for you to
it's hard
to work off of.
And I think some people would say that's fun because they get to really just add like whatever they want. For whatever reason, that feels false to me. I really like I really enjoy figuring out the author's point of view or voice, and then kind of like doing what I feel they would be happy with in their book, and when there isn't anything there, I'm just sort of like, man, what am I doing? I don't know. So to me, the best books are books that are so clear. I'm like, oh, I see these characters. I know these people,
Do you ever hear back from authors?
Rarely, not very often. Typically they aren't really involved in the process. It's not always true. On more independent books, like that aren't through the big 5 publishers, I might have an in with an author or be able to speak to them. There's a couple authors that, because I started doing only independent books where I would contract with the author, personally, I've developed relationships with them. Jonathan Jans is a good example. I did a few of his books, just he and I, before they got picked up by larger publishers. And I just did one of his that is produced by a bigger audio publisher, and I could talk with him throughout the process because I already knew him, which is fun. But it's also kind of nice to be able to do my own thing and then show them at the end,
So most recently you released a audiobook for, you'll tell me the author's name, but it's a short story collection, In a Lonely Place.
Oh yeah, Carl Edward Wagner.
And so that's one of many that you've done through Valancourt, which is a great publisher of reprinting horror.
Yeah, they're so good.
And Victorian. And, I think they started off more with being a queer press, and then I guess they really blew up. They do, yeah.
They still publish a lot of LGBTQ stuff. I love those guys. They're great. They gave me some of my first jobs. I mean, literally, I think my second book or third book maybe was one of theirs. And I don't know, we just hit it off. I like them a lot, and their books are very much the sort of books that I like. So
Yeah. Well, with that in mind, I guess, what is it about the genre horror that excites you as a reader?
man, it's so hard to put into words. You watch these videos online of like we talked about this, like that video of Clive Barker,
Mm-hmm.
like sort of defending the genre to all
To a
of
bunch
these
of
like,
kids.
bunch of kids that are asking him these crazy questions. He's so eloquent about it, and I don't know that I can be that eloquent. I know that growing up, I have really fond memories of watching so many scary movies with my mom and dad. It was very much a tradition in our family to, like on Friday night or whatever, we would rent the Amityville Horror or The
Mm-hmm.
Exorcist. And I don't know, I loved being scared. As I got older, I didn't read as much horror like through high school and college. I think I sort of went into, I got my degree in theater and then English. And so I think I was doing a lot of like heavy literature. And at some point, I realized there's a lot of really beautiful writing in horror, and it could scratch that same itch that, like whatever Gabriel Garcia Marquez could. And now, as I'm older still, I think that horror is the perfect genre to talk about a lot of emotions that I think we don't normally just like talk about. Grief is a really big one. Horror does grief better than anything, I think. Loneliness, the feeling of being the other or not fitting in. And just, fear in general is like the universal emotion. Like everybody is afraid. And it just feels good to have a place to explore that and to, I don't know. Also, it's fun. It's fun to be scared. Yeah.
One thing that you said that I've come to realize of age, because for me, I was a horror reader when I was young. Like Stephen King and Dean Koontz were what got me into reading.
Yeah.
As a kid who was bored with children's books, which those honestly, there's plenty of good ones. That's something I've realized as an adult is that there is good stuff for children too.
Yeah.
But when I got to my 20s, that was when I became a serious reader and had to put childish things like genre aside.
Come back and realize that, like as you said, there is so many talented authors working within that genre and using tools of that genre, which I've also come to realize that I think when people think of horror, they think of a very narrow scope. Usually people who have misconceptions have one idea in their head of what a genre is.
Sure,
and it's the
yeah.
thing that's most unpleasant to them. You have your Saw movies, which I'm not particularly a fan of that kind of thing, but that'll basically affect someone's opinion of the whole thing, or even the idea of that enterprise of horror.
Yeah.
But one thing I think you really come to learn if you do read more, and which is what I took from it, is that it's really, horror comes from this love of the fantastical, love of, dealing with the metaphysical in some way. Clive Barker's obsessed with that aspect of it. But then you start realizing that really there's so many stories like Gabriel Garcia Marquez full of supernatural things happening.
Yes.
Full of political violence, real fear, and so that these are all elements that are in so much. You really can't escape it. I kind of like doing that when people say they're not a horror fan. And then just being like, well, you like that? That's kind of horror.
Yeah,
like
it's such a wide genre. I think it might be, you could argue that it is the widest genre. So much stuff fits into horror that people don't expect. Yeah, like Garcia Marquez, all that like magical realism stuff. There's a scene in, I'm almost sure it's 100 Years of Solitude, where somebody gets shot in the head and then the blood dripping out of their head like goes out the door and snakes its way through the town and finds its way to the dead person's mother. And like that's how she knows that her son has been
I
killed.
think that is that one.
And
yeah.
like that is so great. And it's horror, really. Even though the book is not like scary, but there's elements of horror. Like, you know, Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment is like, you can make an argument that it's a horror novel or
Existential horror. I think
existential, like have you read White Noise by Don
Oh yeah,
DeLillo?
love that book.
It's one of my favorite books. It's funny, it's a comedy, but it's also sort of horror. Like there's
Toxic Airborne Event. I mean, that's pure fear. I'm sure as a father,
oh yeah,
that's, you know,
for
feels
sure
resonating as, you know, your family. And
yeah, and like these are all classics, like literature classics, but I think that they're, you know, and movies too, like so many movies that people don't classify as a horror film, I think really could be.
Oh, absolutely.
You know,
and a lot of times some of the best comedies are horror movies in their own way, especially you're dealing with tensions and misunderstandings and
that like release of tension in a scary part lends itself to humor really well. Like the two genres really work off of each other well, comedy and horror. I mean, yeah, I love that. That makes the genre cool.
Within the genre, you know, there's so many different niches and very particular ways of approaching it. What are some of the genres, with the subgenres rather, that really appeal to you within horror? Like what kind of stories?
Yeah, probably my favorite is haunted house stories or ghost stories, which does seem kind of vague, but the haunted house subgenre is just, it's always interested me. Like I feel like I hear people talk about how they're bored of haunted house movies or like a ghost story, like they're not into because it's kind of, you know, like old school or something. I love that stuff. Just the idea that, you know, the place where you live, like your safe place is not safe, is fun and just works on me. It's hard to say like why am I attracted to that? I don't know. Me, and I really like it for whatever reason.
One thing I've always liked about the haunted house genre is that, well, one, it's really a perfect way of having just kind of full resources to slowly build dread and atmosphere because you are in a place that is in some ways off.
Yeah, and atmosphere is like really what I'm interested in. Over in a book, in a movie, I love atmosphere and tone more so than, you know, the jump. Yeah, and I think I'm less attracted to really big stories, like people like saving the world is not as interesting to me as a smaller contained something. And haunted house stories, not always, but they tend to be contained, you know, like a small cast in one location. It feels like, you know, like Agatha Christie on steroids or something. You know, like Ghost Agatha Christie or something is fun. I like small interpersonal relationships, drama, dread, something, you know, pressing in from the outside. It's why it's kind of, this is obviously not a haunted house movie, but it's why I like Jurassic Park so much, because it's that same isolated location. You can't leave. There's only a few people that are stuck here dealing with like whatever is happening. I've always just been attracted to that.
You know, that controlled environment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the haunted house genre too is so perfect for a lot of stories about human experience, because, you know, in just very basic terms, because there's a lot of approaches to haunted house stories, you usually have the idea of people encroaching upon a place where people have lived before and have gone through similar things. They thought they could live here, but then something went wrong. And balancing that with usually your protagonist, because most haunted house stories tend, I feel like, to be about families moving to a house.
Usually, yeah.
And it's simple, but it works so well. Is that you have so much there. You have the uncertainty of a new place, the idea that you are not original to somewhere. That this
Dealing with the past in some way, and dealing with the past of a place versus also usually dealing with the past of yourself if you're the character.
Yeah, sure. You're always haunted by something that you've done. Like there might be an external haunting or whatever, or a ghost, or but yeah, it's always something in your own past that you're ashamed of or scared of, or that you don't want to come out, that you're dealing with, or it's grief. It's like you're alone in your house and someone that used to be there isn't anymore, or I guess I'm thinking of the Babadook with that.
That's that too.
It's
yeah.
very it can be very poignant and beautiful, and also scary.
Well, I think that's a perfect example of what they call elevated horror, which I think's not an original thought to say. That I'm not crazy about that term, because I feel like there's always been that. That's
Sure.
It goes into like a sort of elitism about genre.
It doesn't need to be elevated. It's already fine. Yeah.
But that quality, I feel like that you were saying that it gives to the storytelling about haunted house, that you can have these human emotions, have this depth to it. I think really resonates in general with ghost stories, because the ghost is usually something that because you can be a ghost. And I feel like the Babadook, I guess you can make an argument, is it a ghost story? But I think it is, in that it performs what a ghost story does, which is you have an invasive force in a home. And what makes that one so, I think, unique is that it really manages to deliver the scares, deliver the dread, but then really go for something kind of abstract and poignant by the end, in a way that I feel like makes it feel so much more worthwhile than as much fun as some haunted house movies are.
Sure. Like I'm great with a haunted house that's purely just a haunted house. But yeah, that one felt it just felt so grounded and real. Even though there's like a monster, like a weird looking monster, it still felt very, you could tell that now I can't remember what her name is, who directed. Was that Jennifer Kent?
Jennifer Kent, yes.
You could tell that she had dealt with grief in some way that I don't know, it was just very real. It was good to watch because it made me feel better.
Have you seen her episode of Cabinet of Curiosities yet? Because she returns to the haunted house and grief. And
that's what I've heard. I haven't watched it yet.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, as far as pulling off like the spooky haunted house feel, it's got some really good moments of that. Because I think there's just also something genuine and unsettling about the idea of waking up in the middle of the night, and the idea of there being presences in your house, and what do you do with that?
Have you ever had like a weird experience like that?
I haven't. No.
Really?
No. Have you?
I've had a couple of. They're not very. They're not like that scary, but I've had a couple of weird ones. Like one time I felt so. In the house that we live in now, I was putting my daughter to sleep, and I fell asleep in her bed. My wife was not home. She was out doing something. And I woke up in her bed to someone like banging on our door. And I was like, oh, I'm sure it's my wife. Maybe she like forgot her keys or something. I don't know. So I ran downstairs, and for whatever reason, right before I walked into the kitchen, which is where our back door is, I just like stopped and just was like, something's weird. Something's really weird. I don't know. And then I like slowly went in the kitchen, and nobody was at the door. My wife wasn't there. There was nothing. So I don't know what that was. It's weird. The other time was in the house we lived in before that one. Also had to do with my daughter. I was bathing her in the bathroom, and in my right ear, a woman just like screamed really loud. So much so that I like acted weird, and my daughter was like, what? And I was like, did you not just hear that? But it was like right in my ear. It was very like, it was obviously not in the environment. It was like a thing that was happening here, you know? And I like went to my wife and I was like, you didn't just like make a noise, did you? She was like, no. So it was just weird. And then a couple days later, I was in her room, which is right next to that bathroom. And the same thing happened again. A woman screamed in my ear and nothing else weird ever happened. It was just a noise. Very strange. I don't know.
Do you feel like that speaks to something more of, I guess, your own imagination, or your, in terms of like it's an experience that reflects something about yourself, or a true external force?
Don't know. I don't know. It's like I don't want to be like it was a ghost, but me and my wife were sitting in our house and we got a knock on our door and we opened it and it was this old lady. And we'd never seen her before. And she said, hey, I used to live in this house. Do you mind if I come in and look at it? Because we had like redone the house. And it was really weird, but she was old, so it didn't feel threatening.
Mm-hmm.
And we were like, okay, sure, come in. And so she came in and she walked around and she was very nice. And then she went to my daughter's room and she said, she did not live here. Her sister lived here. And she went into my daughter's room and she goes, my sister died in this room. And we were like, are you kidding me? Why would you tell us that?
Yeah.
This is where my daughter sleeps. So I don't know. Add that to the other things. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you have a short story right there you could write
There's
if you ever
something.
turn your.
There's something there. Yeah.
Yeah. I think.
Well, you mentioned the Babadook, but what are some other ghost stories, be they movies, books, that are really fond of in terms of them capturing what it is you like about the genre of ghost stories or haunted houses?
The one that comes to my head first is The Elementals by Michael McDowell. I think it's almost perfect. It's, if anybody has not read it, it's very different than a lot of other haunted houses in that it takes place at the beach.
It's very sunny.
It's very sunny. It's very hot. Alabama summer with these sort of dilapidated houses getting filled up by a sand dune on the beach. And there's spirits in one of the houses. Michael McDowell was a great writer. His characters are so specific and weird, very gothic in that they all have some sort of weird gothic element. And it's funny, and I think it's really scary. It's one of the scariest haunted house books I've read. There's some creepy stuff.
There's a scene that I remember very well from that book. People might not know about Michael McDowell is that he was an Alabama native who wrote primarily through the 80s and died in the 90s, unfortunately, from age-related illness. But he also wrote the screenplay for Nightmare Before Christmas and Beetlejuice. I want to mention in particular because there's a character in The Elementals, India, who feels so much like a prototype for Lydia, Winona Ryder's character from Beetlejuice. And in general, I feel like Michael McDowell's books, you could take out all the horror aspects, and those parts are also a lot of fun in his books, and they still would be very interesting because their characters are just they crackle. Like their dialogue's so good.
Yeah, he was really talented. I don't understand how he's not more widely read. He was so good.
I think it has to do with the oversaturation of horror in that period, which Grady Hendrix does a good job at sort of parsing through that kind of things in his Paperbacks from Hell. Have you read that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a horror fan, it's a must-have in your
It's
household.
so good. It looks so good.
You can just flip through. Oh, yeah. But the moment in that novel I remember really well is, I think it's one of the first times that India really sees something, and she's standing outside, and there's this house that's next to where they're staying that's almost, it seems like it's just buried in sand. And she looks up and there's like this skeletal like figure on the awning above it, and she like thinks she sees something, but she's not sure. But it's just such a creepy moment because it's just so what's been just this sunny kind of like almost like a Tennessee Williams kind of play in a way, and then you just have this like, what is this thing? And that book does that so well throughout. It's like you're never really sure what exactly is are the elementals.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so good. It is. There's it's been a while since I've read it. It's probably been 6 or 7 years. There are elements of folk horror in it too, aren't there?
Mhm.
Because at the very beginning, they're at a funeral or something, and that family. Now I can't remember exactly what it is, but don't they have a weird, like, tradition where they like take out the eyes of
It's-
the core or something?
And then it's the mother has died, and what they do is they stab like a vampire the body
that's
of
right.
someone who's dead to make sure I guess they stay dead.
That's
And
right.
yeah, it's a. I remember like I love that book, but I thought it was a little bit unfortunate that in that opening scene it introduces a sister that's a nun, and she's the one who comes up and stabs the body of the mother in front of the whole family, and it's just like this is a great book already.
It's so good.
But she, she's not part of the story, but it still is just he has that offbeat sensibility that I think that really stands out so well. Is that he's not trying. He understands the genre. He understands how it works, and he's very pragmatic and practical about horror. I feel like, and that works in his favor. But he just doesn't particularly care about doing it in the way that you necessarily are expecting.
Yeah, he was his own writer for sure.
And
but that element of like folk horror is another subgenre that I really like, of like the old timey ways being passed down to generations is another thing that I really find interesting.
When you have it's the rational mind versus the superstitious mind. Yep. I feel like it's so expressed so well in folk horror. I feel like I'm really drawn to that aspect, the idea that people would rely on something that has been done for ages ago in much harsher times versus what you think you understand about the world. Really, a lot of horror is based on a Dracula is a perfect example of it's a Victorian novel where industrialization's booming. It's a book that's all about technology in terms of they're always like recording things, they're writing, sending letters, all about sort of the progress of that. But then there's this thing that's the unknowable. It's the evil that can't be explained.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's something that doesn't sit well with a species that's so focused on moving forward and developing themselves, and that like we are, evolving in some social way, when it's like, or are we really? Or are we just that?
Sure.
Is it just one setback away from reverting to something that's more primal and more visceral and less, I guess, egalitarian really in how you approach your life?
Yeah.
What's a good folk horror book that you've read?
My favorite is probably Harvest Home by Thomas Tryon. Trying to think of other ones that I really, really liked. For whatever reason, that one sticks out in my mind. I read it at a very weird time personally. We were going through something very hard, and normally when I'm reading something or watching something in a time like that, it like really sticks in my mind, and that one did for sure, and it's one of my favorite books. But that's perfectly got the somebody new comes into the town, and the town is a little bit weird, and they are keeping up with the old ways, and
it's such a good book.
It's so good, good,
and it's got one of my favorite female antagonists too, and it's
Widow Fortune.
She's such a. That's one thing Tyron was so good at, was the physicality of characters. Like I remember details like she always has a pair of scissors she keeps
around her waist. It's just like details like that. Just so that's what I want in a story. I don't want every person sort of blank slate, as you were saying, when you get sometimes with a bad book. You want those details that really make this person character
Yeah.
come alive.
And it's funny because as a narrator, that's the sort of detail that like tells you how to play a character. Like it doesn't need to say that their voice sounds a certain way or that they're, from a certain part of the country, so they might have an accent. It's stuff like that. Like an older woman who like always has a pair of scissors tied to her. Like that's so specific. Like you can do something with that.
Mhm.
Like that changes the way that you approach and voice the character.
Even though it says a lot about it.
It doesn't have anything to do with their voice, and yet it informs it.
What are some books that, and they don't have to be horror, that you would love to be able to do as a reader? Like, your white whales. That doesn't even have to be like realistic. Just if you could, in a perfect world, get to do this audiobook.
Yeah. Man, there are a lot. A lot of them are horror, though. I have no problem being pigeonholed in a certain thing. I really like Southern Gothic stories, and I really like horror stories, and I tend to work on that a lot, and that doesn't bother me at all. I like it. This is going to sound really cliche, but I would love to do something like Harry Potter. To be a part of something that is such a cultural phenomenon, and to be, like an integral part to like so many kids' lives, that's probably a lot of kids' first experiences with literature in a lot of ways. I mean, they might have read books when they were younger, but to be that involved and into and looking forward to the next thing, and I would love to be a part of something like that.
Yeah.
It would be fun to do one of those books and then get to see everybody's reaction online, or that would just be fun. And plus there's so many characters, getting to return to them again and again in different situations is really fun. When I narrated Blackwater, it was similar because it was very long, and you would get to come back to characters at different, times in their lives or different weird situations and see how they would interact. And Blackwater is another book similar to Harry Potter in that you just feel so attached to those people that you're just interested to know what happens to them. So something like a Harry Potter would be really fun. Gosh, what else? I don't know. I mean, there are books that I'm like, mad I didn't get to do, like stuff like, Haunting of Hill House, I probably would have killed somebody to do. But of course, you need a woman to narrate that. And the person Bernadette Dunn, who did narrate it, she's incredible. So I'm clearly not the right person, but still I'm like, oh, it would have been so good.
There's a really good audiobook of her other novel, We've Always Lived in a Castle, which is my personal favorite
really?
of hers.
That's great. I haven't listened to the audiobook, though.
She does I can't remember the actress's name does it, but she does such a good job, especially with
It might be Bernadette Dunn again.
Yeah.
I think she's done more of her short stories. I think. I'm not sure.
But she just really captures the voice of the narrator, this girl who kind of sees the world through almost like an occult way, even if the events aren't necessarily occult themselves. And just, in that book, there's a component of this town that is very antagonistic towards the family, and like they make these songs up about them. And like when she sings the songs, and it's just a sort of perfect acerbic way of doing it. Like it's a really cool audiobook.
Does she sing in it?
Yeah, she does, but
Cool.
it's like in this very like good, like mocking way that really works well for the tone. One last question. Where would you want listeners to start with your output?
Oh boy. Blackwater is definitely the most popular book that I've done, and it's certainly one of the best. It's an incredible novel. It's 30 hours long, so it might not be maybe the place for somebody to just start. I would probably say I did a book called A Night in the Lonesome October by Roger Zelazny, and it's an amazing, amazing novel. It's so well written. It's pretty short. It's like 6.5 or 7 hours, so it's very digestible. It moves really fast. The characters are super interesting. It's all of the sort of classic movie monsters, classic Victorian novel characters have all come together for this kind of, I don't want to blow what it actually is, but this kind of mystical ritual that happens only when there's a full moon on Halloween. So it's like Jack the Ripper, Dr. Frankenstein and his monster, a werewolf, one of the witches from Macbeth, Sherlock Holmes, Burke and Hare. Like
Oh, I love Burke and Hare.
all of these famous characters are involved in this ritual, and they're animal familiars. So each character has an animal that goes with them, and the story is told from the point of view of Jack the Ripper's dog. And it is a great book. It's one of the most proud I've been of my own work. It's probably a good place to start. And then if you like that, I'd go to Blackwater.
Matt, I want to thank you for joining me today for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I hope we can get to do this ghost story event again in the future.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Well, thank you and have a good day. And
Thanks.
thank you for listening.